you for coming. My name is Sean, and we're being recorded. My name is Sean Trewick. I'm a trial methodologist at the University of Aberdeen. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we have some great speakers here. So we'll start with Professor Kerry Hood, who's the director of the UK CRC CTU Trials Unit Network and Dean of Research and Innovation for the College of Biomedical Life Sciences at Cardiff University. So we'll hear from Kerry. We also have Dr. Vicky Shepherd, who's a Principal Research Fellow at the Centre for Trials Research at Cardiff University. And as you'll very quickly gather, Vicky is leading a programme of research around trials involving adults with impaired capacity to consent and has led all of the work that we're going to hear about today. And we also have Sian Jones, who's going to give us a PPI, public contributor perspective, a little bit later on, also joining us as a speaker. And I'll introduce the panel that we'll have later on when we get to that point. So what we're going to do in the first part, it's a sort of game of two halves, really. The first part, we'll hear from Kerry about the importance of inclusivity in trials and how tools such as the consult e-learning that we're about to hear about can improve inclusivity in research. And then Vicky is going to explain the background to the training, so the consult e-learning training, and how it can support researchers. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to have some personal reflections from Sian Jones, who contributed to this work as a member of the lay advisory group. And then the second half is we'll have an expert panel, and that panel will answer your questions. We do actually already have some of your questions, but those questions are going to be around, I guess, what are the key challenges when conducting research with adults with impaired capacity to consent and how we can address these. So this is going to be a great opportunity to have the panel's insights. As I said, I'll introduce those members when we get to that point. But it'll be a great opportunity to gain some insights into the issues around involving people with impaired capacity to consent. Please do, while you're listening to our speakers, put any questions that come to you into the Q&A. So we'll gather all of the questions into that panel discussion. So a question comes to you, put it into the Q&A. And as I said, we already have received some. We are recording the webinar too, you'll have heard that. So it will be available afterwards for you or indeed your colleagues who were unable to attend today. So I think that's the introduction, all the initial housekeeping, which leaves me then over to introduce our first speaker, which is Kerry Hood, who is going to talk about inclusivity in trials and why that is so important. So over to you, Kerry. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, and delighted to, let's see if I can manage to share my slides. I did practice beforehand. There we go. So delighted and welcome all of you to this session. This is going to be a bit of reflection, but I'm also going to tell you a little bit about, as a CTU network, how we work within this area. But I won't take too long because I think the reflections from the work from Vicky and Sian is going to be really, really important. So as Sean said, I'm the director of the CTU network. And as a network, we are, see if I can manage to move on. If you don't know who we are, we're a network of 50 registered clinical trials units across the whole of the UK. And we all units have to reach a set threshold and standard in order to be able to be members in terms of their quality and their scientific development. And then we operate and work through various working groups, operational groups, task and finish groups, to look at how we can improve things for the future. Now, sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that there isn't one on inclusivity. And that's actually because when we discussed it, we felt it went into everything we did. So we don't have a separate group on inclusivity within the CTU network. What we have is we have asked every single one of our working groups and task and finish groups and operational groups to consider how inclusivity affects what they do. Now, very much we're talking about recruitment a lot of the time when we talk about inclusivity, but actually what data we collect, how we report it, how we analyze it, all of those things matter for us to think about in terms of how we do trials. So I'm going to flick through that. Now, one of the things we do in terms of the CTU network is produce various guidance. And this is one of the ways we try and get changes into practice. And you can see there some of the areas of guidance, and we negotiate and agree these with the MHRA, with the HRA when we're producing them. So it also gives us a real way to get things into practice. We all agree that inclusivity is an area that we need to push forward, and how we conceptualize it and how we address it. But we're also, as members, very involved in a lot of the publications around different aspects of trial development. Now, as a CTU network, we are currently reviewing our strategies and our what our registration review criteria will be. And if anyone is interested in that, there'll be opportunities for people to feed in, but it is quite clear that approaches to inclusivity will be a core part of our strategy going forward for the next 5 years, and indeed will also be, may end up being part of our registration review criteria, how people address these things. So what does the CTU network provide to this area? And I wanted to pick up on a few ways in which we as a CTU network see our way of working. And this is about inclusivity, but it's also in terms of more general how we design trials. So we absolutely provide the trial design leadership that is out there. That is a key component of what we do. We do it under the UK CRC banner. We also sit on most of the funding panels. So, and as I said, we universally are focusing on this as an area to go forward. However, there are two ways in which we're also a community of practice. One is a community of practice for implementation, and I'm sure a large number of you probably are linked to a CTU in terms of the way you think about things. And we're also a community of practice for understanding how things currently are and how we do change. And I think that's a really, really important thing to recognise, that we need to not just do methodological development, but do things like this to try and get it into practice, which is what Vicky's going to talk about now. There is some brilliant work on how we get new methods into practice, and I would like to ask all of you to have a think about the fact that, so this is a paper, if you haven't read it, it's worth a read. I'd like all of you to have a think about the point in here about having implementation champions. So you're coming today to learn about a new way of doing stuff, but actually, if we truly want to change how we are as a culture going forward, consider whether you want to become a champion for those changes as well, because that really will get things out into practice in more detail. Now, I've kind of not been talking about the things that Sean said I'd talk about, which is why inclusivity is so important. So I'm going to finish off with a little personal reflection. So the picture here is my grandmother, Dorothy Hill, who was a fierce, independent Scotswoman, and as she got older, she developed dementia, and I was her carer as her dementia became worse. Her life shrunk from this woman who had been, first in the family to go to university in Aberdeen. So great, Sean. Had done all these amazing things in her life. And suddenly her life was shrinking and her choices were being taken away from her by the fact that she had a condition that reduced her capacity. And to me, whilst we're focusing on research, actually there is a rights-based component to saying that someone like her should not have all of her choices taken away from her. Because of the fact that she has a condition which affects her ability to affects her large brain's ability to still comprehend all the things that are happening around her. And so whilst there is a completely a justification that is based on how we make sure our science is good science and generalizable, I also think there is a rights-based reason for why we should be here. And I have put a quote by Aristotle, and that's because I think we talk a lot about research excellence across the board in various areas. And I think recognizing that we cannot have excellence unless we are acting rightly, and that we need to work at that and train and do it by habit and include by custom and practice, then actually we will never have excellence unless we can do those things. So I'm going to stop there, because actually I'm going to hand over to Vicky to tell us a bit more.
Thank you, Kerry. And just to remind everybody, there will be time for questions, but we'll do that in the Q&A. So if you have questions for Kerry or about anything Kerry has raised, then please do put them in the Q&A. And now, as Kerry said just there at the end, we'll hand over to Vicky, and then Sean will also speak too. So Vicky, please, thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks very much, Kerry, as well. So this next part of the talk will kind of set some of the background to why we've identified this kind of knowledge gap and what we've developed the training to try and fulfill some of that knowledge gap. And that will take us on then to thinking about how some of this looks in different contexts with different populations. And that's where we can start to then unpick through the question and answer what this looks like for different populations and different situations. So I'm going to set a little bit of background first of all. So you'll all be very well aware, and that's probably why you're with us today, that when we think about research trials, especially including adults who lack capacity to consent, there are particular ethical and legal considerations that we have to take account of. And those legal frameworks, of course, differ depending on the type of research we're doing, whether it's a clinical trial of a medicinal product or governed by the mental capacity legislation alternatively, and where we're doing that. So England and Wales for the Mental Capacity Act, Scotland have their own version, Northern Ireland have their own version, and of course internationally there will be multiple different legal frameworks that we have to operate within. And all of that kind of complexity and navigating all of that can mean it quite challenging to conduct trials involving adults lacking capacity. And it's often those complexities and the fear around those complexities that leads to this population frequently being excluded from trials where they're important clinical population who would benefit from the intervention. And we've got some examples there on the side. So for example, hip fracture, stroke, palliative care. So you can see how this runs throughout all the different populations we have to think of. And then, of course, the trials that do include them may well struggle to recruit, and that can lead them to being underpowered or abandoned. So, for example, trials in emergency and critical care are 4 times more likely to be prematurely discontinued due to slow recruitment compared with trials in other settings. And as we've already heard from Kerry, excluding these populations from trials raises concerns about the lack of generalizability of our findings, but also this inequitable opportunity for these populations to take part in, to benefit from research. And we also have less idea what their experiences, perspectives, what matters to these populations are as well. And that's that rights-based component Kerry mentioned. And all of this can lead to what I often term as evidence bias care, where we have more evidence for some populations than we do for others. And those inequalities from an evidence perspective spans and widens the inequalities from a health and care perspective that these populations also experience. And we can think about this in terms of disability. So this was a recent analysis done in the US, looking at disability-related exclusion criteria in clinical trials across 4 common conditions, so dementia, depression, diabetes, and lung cancer. And you can see there that cognitive disability at the top featured very highly in these exclusion criteria. And there were relatively few study protocols that actually explained what these justifications for these inclusions are. And you can see the conclusions that the authors came to, but also their recommendations there on the right, which are aimed at research ethics committees and funders, that they need to pay much more attention to the eligibility criteria, both in terms of the terminology and language, particularly where it may unintentionally exclude these populations, but also the lack of scientific or ethical justification. And that much more needs to be done to plan ahead about how we design these studies, but also the guidance is needed with an emphasis on supporting participants to make decisions, thinking about individualized assessments of capacity, and those kind of reasonable accommodations to enable participation that we're more used to thinking about in terms of disability and accessing services and care and other components, but also need to think about when we think about trials as well. And I'll come on more to think about the guidance component in a moment. And as we've already touched on through Kerry, inclusivity in research is a really key priority area at the moment. An increasing focus on that through the previous year's NHR's Include initiative, for example, but also worldwide. And of course, now a key strategic priority for funders like the NHR that as of, I think, last week, now have a requirement for inclusion to be a condition in order to receive NHR funding. And they have guidance alongside that, including costing guidance and how that can be reflected in the cost. But also the incoming UK clinical trial regulations due to be implemented in early 2026 will very much feature inclusivity in the guidance that accompanies that. And as Kerry has already mentioned, in terms of the MHRA and the HRA doing a lot of work around this from a diversity inclusion perspective. And the need to specifically address the exclusion of adults lacking capacity was highlighted in the recent World Health Organization clinical trials best practice guidance that came out. And we can also think about this from the global aging population, so people living longer with conditions that might impair their ability to provide consent. And the Nuffield Council of Bioethics in their Future of Aging very much picked up on that idea when we think about how we're going to support evidence-based care and treatment improvement in the future, and specifically if we exclude people who have a condition associated with aging like dementia. And they also touch on some of the consult work in their areas of best practice. And why is this challenging, and where do we know it's particularly challenging? So this was a study I led a couple of years ago as part of the Consult programme. So these were interviews with researchers, research nurses and other professionals to explore the barriers and facilitators. And they spoke very much about how these kind of span the whole research process. And of course, we think about this beforehand, research priorities, for example, and afterwards when we think about dissemination, but specifically here about how actually we have to navigate some of these challenges when we're designing a trial, when we're thinking about the ethical approvals process, when we're thinking about how we can provide participants with information and support them to make decisions, assessing capacity, should that be required. And of course, under the Mental Capacity Act, there's a presumption that people have capacity, so we only assess capacity where we have concerns. And then if someone does lack capacity to provide consent on that particular occasion for that particular decision, we then need to approach an alternative decision maker, so a consultee, a legal representative, usually a family member or friend. And then, of course, this isn't a process. This is not a one-off event. So how we might need to revisit consent and consultation during a trial, particularly where people might gain capacity, lose capacity, or have fluctuating capacity during a trial. And the three main themes that came out of that work were this complexity of trials involving adults lacking capacity that I've already mentioned, and this quote from a researcher: "It feels like an insurmountable black box of horrendousness that I dare not go. It feels very much like if you get it wrong, you'll be illegal and the ethics police will come for you." And they went on to say, and that's why they avoid it. And then the importance of having access to appropriate support and resources in order to know how to include adults lacking capacity. And this was a researcher that talked about how they looked online, this kind of potluck Googling for information, and they thought that they had understood it, but actually when they went to the ethics committee, they found that no, they'd not interpreted that and described that being quite a horrible situation for them. And so again, much more likely to not want to go there again. And then that also need for more knowledge and expertise to support future trials. And this is where people spoke about how better support and guidance might be quite helpful to give people confidence to do this type of research. That then led on to the development in the last couple of years, the Include Impaired Capacity Consent Framework. So this tool for researchers to use when they're designing a study. And that's very much come out of that NHR Include work and the ethnicity framework that Sean and colleagues developed. And then we adapted it as part of the Trials Methodology Research Partnership Group to fit this context, really. So to think about how we design trials involving adults lacking capacity. It has this, a version of the same 4 questions from the ethnicity framework, but adapted for this context. And question 4 particularly picks up on the idea about how consent processes, how appropriate information, how we might need to tailor all of that for this population, and then how we might summarize the actions and importantly resources we might need to do this properly. And we developed a whole toolkit of resources to help alongside that. So completed framework, so you can see what it looks like. There's an easy read guide to using the framework to support public involvement component in that, and then a whole website of resources as well. But what it also highlighted was, and this is a quote from that same Consult Enable study, where people recognise that actually, although there is some training out there on this topic, so people spoke a little bit about GCP, that of course is much higher level training. They spoke about the NHR version for recruiting adults lacking capacity, that some of those training offerings were not either fit for purpose or they simply weren't there in this kind of space. And that in order to use tools like the Include framework, they would need more training on this topic. And that's what led to the Consult training programme. And you can see there some of the support that we've had to develop it. So members of the project team, who are many of whom are here today. So Martina, Nikki, and Kim Munnery very kindly provided some technical support as well. Our research advisory group, some of whom are on the panel today, and then importantly our lay advisory group, again, some of whom are here today, and you'll hear from Sian a little bit later on. So in terms of the actual process, what we did, we developed the training over 4 different stages. Importantly, we did an initial survey to really explore what researchers' views about the current gaps in training were, the support that they needed, and the main challenges that they encountered when developing trials like this, and what they had found worked well, that idea that we can learn from best practice. The survey also explored their experiences of public involvement for trials involving these populations, and all of that informed the development of this training, which is based on that wider Consult work. And the idea being that this would then upskill researchers alongside using tools like the Include impaired capacity consent framework to conduct trials like this in the future. Just briefly touching on the stakeholder survey, so 81 researchers and research teams from across the UK, many of whom might be on this call, so many thanks to those people that kindly contributed to that. You can see that many people worked in CTU, so part of the network that Kerry's described, but also drawn across academia more broadly, industry and the NHS. We were really pleased that people taking part had this wide-ranging roles in research. You can see separated out on the left-hand side. And importantly, they often worked with a broad range of populations. You can see from older people through to Huntington's disease and everything in between. And that really gave us the confidence to know that actually this training hopefully is appropriate for people working with across all populations that might have impaired capacity. Although, as I've mentioned, there will be context population-specific issues that we need to think about as well. And so we drew on the findings to develop the e-learning content. That kind of knowledge gap I've mentioned already, people talked about how actually they would benefit from having an overview of the legislation, thinking about what the best practice is for providing information, assessing capacity, managing changes in capacity throughout a trial, thinking about the information related to specific groups and participants and types of trials. They spoke about the main challenges they encountered, which again was around the complexity of the legal framework and how that differs, particularly across the UK, and the governance aspect as well. So navigating, working with RECs, sponsors, R&D departments, and how they themselves might not have knowledge in this area. So again, that's given us the confidence that this training should be appropriate for all those groups of people. And that quote that you can see there struck really hard. So it's easier to exclude people than not. And that is what this is all about, making it easier to include people, taking away some of those barriers. People also talked about what they found had worked well. They spoke about having clear consent processes, maybe in the protocol, guidance for sites, flowcharts, again, making it easier to work with these kind of processes. They also spoke about having things like data from a feasibility study, embedding qualitative study, and that actually helped them develop the processes, but also justify and provide support for the approaches that they were using. And then where some alternatives to consent might be appropriate. So when we think about Section 251, so those exceptions to requiring consent for the use of data through the confidentiality advisory group approvals process. And so just to come on to what is actually in the training. So as you can see there, we've separated this out into 4 core modules. You can see the brief description of those on the screen. The training is free to access. It's through the Moodle site. So you create an account in Moodle and you can see our training there. It can be completed at your own time, so all in one go, or you can complete a module at a time, whatever is your choosing. And importantly, return to it as you need to, so it can act as a kind of desktop resource as well. Once you complete all the modules, you can download a certificate of completion. And again, people told us that was important, perhaps to justify or to show an ethics committee that the people working on the trial will be trained in this area, but also for that professional development as well. And we've also embedded a short feedback survey, and we really do encourage you to complete that so we can refine and add to the content as more people use it. So the content itself, there is some very detailed content you can see for each of the 4 modules that will bring you to a screen. You can see the menu down the left-hand side. There are often tabs across to move through the content. We think each one takes about 20 to 60 minutes to complete, obviously depending on how much you go into the additional content. We have lots of links to resources, again, because people told us this was something that was really important to them. So in addition to the modules, each one of those has resources and references throughout, and at the end of each module, you'll see a summary of all the references used within that module. And then there's also a separate module that you can access that has sort of brought together at a higher level some of the resources as well. And you can see they signpost to the Include framework and to the Consult website with other resources, signpost to the HRA website, where again, lots of information there, but we know that they're on different pages and might be hard for people to navigate. So we've put links directly to the various pages that will support that area of learning. And then because people also told us that what they wanted kind of top tips and those kind of other components as well, on the right-hand side, you can see a version there, which is our key recommendations when applying for ethical approval. And it talks about the questions an ethics committee have to ask of an application and how you can demonstrate in your application how you're justifying meeting the various legal requirements. And then we've got case studies, we've got some short videos. Each module ends with a very short quiz, again, just to support learning, just to bring some of these components to life. And again, this focuses on supporting participant decision-making, thinking about assessing capacity in an individualized way, having reasonable accommodations to enable participation, all those components that I mentioned at the beginning, that recommendation that is what people actually needed. And of course, public involvement really key throughout all of this. And we were very lucky to have a lay advisory group who have lived experience in this area to support us to develop the training. And rather than separate it out, which is something we discussed as a team, it's embedded throughout the whole e-learning. And so the case studies reflect that. There's videos, there's other resources again. And going back to that researcher survey, what they told us worked well, again, has been embedded throughout. When we think about how the UK standards for public involvement, so those some of those kind of key headings there, about working together, so involving charities and organisations who are already experienced with working with these populations, thinking about relationship building, time, communication, but also the impact. So researchers told that actually having public involvement in their trials, specifically in this area, helped with understanding the acceptability, perhaps of the alternative consent processes, but also provided reassurance both to the ethics committee, but also to sites that they had carefully designed these processes. And then importantly, co-presenting findings, so working out the contextualization of those findings as well. We're very lucky today to have Sian Jones with us, who is going to tell us a little bit about her own perspective. So Sian, if I can invite you to turn on your camera and sound.
Yes, that's okay. Can you hear me?
We can indeed, thank you. So I wonder, Sian, if you want to introduce yourself first of all and just say a little bit about your experience of supporting research.
Well, my name is Sian Jones. I've been a member for 14 years now with Healthcare Research Wales, and I've contributed to well over 20 studies and trials. I'm very passionate about Victoria's work, your work, as my father had impaired capacity, and I've been an advocate for many children, young people and adults who were unable to speak to them for themselves.
Thank you. And perhaps you could also tell us why you think, from your view, it's important to include people who lack capacity to consent in research.
Well, I feel that researchers would benefit to include those people who have impaired capacity, as well as those from diverse communities. The research could be much more meaningful with different perspectives and may reveal outcomes that were totally unexpected.
Thank you. And I know this is something that you've passionately advocated for in the trials that you've been involved in. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about perhaps an example when this is something that you've brought up with one of the trial teams you've been working with.
Well, I'm a PPI member on the Clarity trial. The Clarity trial, I'm a member of the TMG, as I was a carer for my parents who suffered with arteriosclerosis. My father became an amputee eventually and then died, and my mother also died of the condition. So the study is involving 3 arms of medication after the patients have had angioplasty. I suggested the consent study with some details about yourself, Victoria, as I felt they should include patients who have impaired capacity in their study. Well, the outcome is they have since changed their protocol to include consent in their work, which I'm really pleased about.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that and for the kind words as well. Much appreciated. Thank you, Sian.
The last piece, shall I just finish that off?
Please do, say what you want. Yeah.
Oh, involving people with impaired capacity, I am sure will add to any study and trial. There could be invaluable information shared that would inform science and will benefit patients in the NHS in the future. I feel I want to make a difference, and hopefully within the work I've already completed with you, Victoria, I hope I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure we could say that you have. It's been much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I'll do is I'll just end with the details about how to access the training that you can see up on the screen there. So you can scan that QR code that will take you to the website where you can then access the Moodle link to create an account. You can download instructions if you've not used Moodle before as well. If you have any questions after today, you can contact us via the email address you can see on the screen and also via social media. So you can see a link there to where you can find me on social media. So thank you very much. We will put these up again at the end of the webinar as well in case you miss it. But for the moment, I'll hand back to Sean. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky and Sian. And noted, Sian, from your comments, for all of us, it's a great reflection of how important PPI is to improving health research, and that PPI contribution does change designing, changing protocols, as you highlighted. So what we've got now, part 2, if you like, of today is a Q&A. We have an expert panel. So I'll introduce the panel. So in addition to Kerry and Vicky, who we've already met, we have 4 other individuals. So we have first Dr. Amy Russell, who's at the University of Leeds and is leading a portfolio of work to address health inequalities and a focus on people with learning disabilities. We also have Dr. Anna Volkmer, who's at University College London, clinical academic speech and language therapist, again with a particular interest in developing interventions to help people with dementia. We have Dr. Mark Jays, Manchester Metropolitan University, also an academic speech and language therapist with a focus on communication disability, including mental capacity assessment and supported decision-making. Mark did the training this morning, so questions linked to what it's like, great to direct towards Mark. And finally, on our panel, we have Professor Kerry Woolfalls at the University of Liverpool, whose research focuses on exploring clinician and patient perspectives to inform design and conduct of clinical trials without prior consent, so emergency and critical care situations. So that's our panel, and if our panel members could switch on their cameras, and we'll get to see who they are. And then just to remind everybody who's on the session today, if you have questions, please do start putting them in the Q&A, and we'll go through those in the next 25 minutes or so before we close. Now, what we do have, while people are thinking about questions, we do actually have some questions that are actually quite a long list of questions, in fact, that have been sent in beforehand. So I'm going to kick off. And again, it's just to get people's thoughts working if you're sending in questions. But the first question is actually going to come to you, Kerry. And it's a sort of big picture question, really. And this is what it is. So will there be a way to see or ensure that trials are actually embedding EDI approaches and strategies in their trials? Like, is there some form of accountability? Whose responsibility is it to make sure it happens?
So really, really good question, because I don't think it's a simple answer at the moment, but I think it's the question we should be asking ourselves. So at the moment, this is predominantly being driven by the funders. So, but obviously they don't fund all research. So I think that's a custom and practice. They're using their weight as the NHR to really push this forward. There was a point when we were expecting the new clinical trial regulations, I know that only applies to drug trials, to incorporate this into law. It looks like that's not going to happen, and it's going to be in guidance instead. But I would still expect the HRA and the MHRA to be incorporating that, therefore, into their audits and their assessment as to whether people are doing what they say they do, because that's what they do for drug trials and device trials. As CTUs, we can do something in terms of our registration criteria and what might be there in terms of people being evidence. They should do that. That's probably the trickier one, is that in reality, the responsibility should sit with sponsors of trials. And actually, there's not the same level of engagement, I think, with sponsors as there potentially could be. So that's kind of a summary from my perspective. So I think there's some things we need to put in there. Now, the HRA are actually out, and MHRA are out for consultation at the moment about how they might expect people to look at this. So I would imagine they will be coming in. I do also, I'm keeping talking, but there'll be some other. I'd also have a slight concern that from a trials unit perspective and a researcher's perspective, we can focus on setting up our protocols to be as inclusive as possible, but we also need staff on the ground not to be selecting patients who are quicker and easier for them to put in. So there is also, I think, from a CTU perspective, we absolutely have to grasp our responsibility to design, to make things inclusive by design, but there's still potentially a practice gap to the ground.
Yeah, agreed. So clearly there's shared responsibility there, and we ourselves have part of that responsibility, but it's not only us. Does anybody else on the panel want to add anything to Kerry's before we go? Great, Amy, please.
I just wanted to briefly mention the data we're collecting, the demographic data, which evidences how inclusive our current practice is. And we still have a problem with the way that's created what we're asking and recording. And of course, part of what we see is when that is recorded, it reveals that we are recruiting the people who we always recruit, who are simpler and quicker. So we have a lack of agreement on what data should be collected and when, and I know there's work going on about that as well, but I think that's the evidence that we need to then show that we need to bring in some kind of checking, auditing, mandating of inclusivity, especially proportional to the populations. So, you know, certain conditions are predominant in certain populations, like Vicky was talking about hip fracture, and so we have to begin asking questions about the representativeness of those samples. Agreed,
Amy. And I'll come on to you in a moment, Anna, but I was a meeting yesterday hosted by the HRA, and it was a big meeting, 100 people or so, lots of rec people there. And one of the questions there was on exactly this point, Amy, and similarly to thinking of a responsibility that you mentioned, Kerry, and what this questioner's point was, he was a researcher. He wants to be inclusive. He wants to know what's the baseline of our population that we should be aiming to engage in our trial. And the health service was unable to tell him. He had no idea. The health service has no idea. And that is a problem. So there's a sort of parallel stream of activity needed within the health service to enable us to design research that reflects the service as well and the clinical population. Anna, I can see questions are coming in now. So that's great. So over to you, Anna.
I just wanted to flag that World Health Organization guidance that was published only in I think September, 24th of September this year, on trials that make and that one of the key points in that guidance is about inclusivity, and they've appealed to all governments around the world to prioritize this issue of inclusivity, some of the recommendations they've made around inclusivity are actually based on this idea of trust in and healthy use, and the idea if we're more inclusive, people will trust us more as health professionals and researchers. So I just wanted to share that it's there's power, bigger powers as well that are really pushing on governments internationally to take this on board. I thought that was an important. I think it's very valuable to know that we can push from the bottom and from the top in this way.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, it emphasizes this is not only a UK initiative, this is global. So I'm going to ask one of the questions that's just come in, and this is to anybody, so put your hand up if you fancy having a go. So the question is there any guidance regarding what to do when deciding whether to involve someone who has been assessed as lacking capacity, when that individual has advocates with different opinions regarding their participation? Anybody got any thoughts on that? So Vicky, your hand is up, and then Anna.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult question, one that comes up a lot. And that's where you see that difference between, okay, what this looks like in principle and what it's actually like in practice, when, you know, sometimes families have family members that disagree because that's what families do. So I think the guidance is, of course, the idea being that you approach a consultee based on who you think is most appropriate in that situation. And one of the difficulties is we don't encourage people to nominate someone ahead of time in the way that we do when we think about other areas of life. And that's what that idea of advanced research planning comes in, that I've been doing a little bit of work on recently, how we can encourage people to think and plan ahead of time about research in the same way we do about advanced care planning. So part of that, I think, is for everyone having a conversation in clinical practice, in research, with people that potentially have an interest or might be at risk of losing capacity in the future, just having a conversation about who they would like to act, to make decisions about research to be included in decisions ahead of time. So that's that kind of prior thinking. But of course, in the moment, it can be really difficult. And that's where often bringing people together and trying to communicate is really key. And you just need one person back to the consultee. You don't have to have harmony. But of course, when we think about research, you're very unlikely to include someone in research where there are family members that are in strong disagreement. So I think the short answer is there isn't specific guidance out there. It is one of those difficulties we have to navigate. Hopefully, encouraging people to have those conversations might make that a little more straightforward in the future.
Thanks, Vicky. Anna.
I was just going to make the point that some guidance suggests that almost everybody is able to make an informed decision. I say almost because not everyone, given the appropriate practical supports are put in place. So I just wanted to step back even a little bit to the idea of when you're having those conversations with the person, to avoid having to use a consultee, if you present written information in an accessible format, if you present in a simple, so in a lay way that makes sense to a person, and with all practicable support, so that might involve other health professionals helping you draft accessible information, based making sure a person's wearing their hearing aids, making sure they've got their glasses on, got an interpreter. That guidance may actually help avoid this situation in the first place. So I thought I'd provide some prophylactic advice.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. So I have another question, which is one of the ones we got in beforehand, and it actually links a little bit to this. So it was a two-part question. The second part of it, which is about what we might do in advance. I think Vicky and Anna, you've addressed that, but there's another part to it, which was how do you work out what level of capacity a person has? And Mark's name is written next to this question. So I wonder, Mark, whether you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's an interesting question about level of capacity, and it's a kind of ongoing debate, I think, about what is the appropriate level of capacity. What I would say is that when you're considering capacity, obviously start off by thinking about what's the legal framework where you're working, and we're talking about the content of this e-learning may be applicable to people in different international jurisdictions. So think about the legal framework where you work. Not to start at a point where we're thinking we need to assess capacity for everybody. We need to assume capacity. Most legal frameworks have a statutory requirement that we start by assuming capacity. We need reason to believe, as Vicky said earlier, that somebody may have difficulty providing informed consent before we start thinking about capacity and assessing it. And we can base that on observations that we've made ourselves, but also guidance from others that know the person, and maybe a past history of having difficulty making decisions like this. We also need to think about support, and Anna's just illustrated that beautifully, the sorts of things we need to be thinking about to maximise somebody's ability to give consent. So thinking about various sensory needs, cognitive, communication, emotional, mental health needs, perhaps, thinking about the environment, thinking about the way we provide information. And then I think we need to think about what's relevant information and the sort of information that we think somebody should be able to understand and use in order to provide consent. The key aspects you would hope somebody would understand about a trial in order to really fully understand their involvement in it. And we shouldn't be setting the bar too high, and there is case law around this in relation to other decisions. We need to plan our capacity assessment, if we need to do one, around a functional test that involves that information. And I would really here emphasize the importance of good PPI work again, about talking to people who may be the sorts of people who'd involved in the study. What sort of information do they think is important? I don't think there's any specific guidance about the type of information you would need to include in the capacity assessment, but I think it's the information that would go in an information sheet. Yeah, we need to think about the way we adapt that information to help people understand it, and the way we ask questions to gauge how much they understand it as well, and making that as accessible as possible. Yeah. So that's what I would say, but I don't think there's a particular level and that we should be aiming for. We need to decide that as a study team.
And there is it's a judgment, but you have given some pointers there, and it made me think while you were talking about something you'd said, Kerry, in your opening talk, which is we don't want to take people's choices away from them. So where we can enable an individual to make a choice themselves, or we would want to do that, and the bar we may want to choose where to place that bar to make sure that choice is available to the individual, if at all possible. So I'm going to ask one of the other questions that's come in live today. And this, I guess, again, for anybody, but I think maybe Kerry, you might, Kerry Woolfall. Sorry, I'm sure we've got two Kerrys. And then Kerry, actually, interestingly, both Kerrys, but Kerry Woolfall, maybe you too. But so here it goes. Have any clinical trial units considered whether there's anything that they can do to close the theory practice gap that, Kerry Hood, you mentioned in your opening talk? So researchers, and particularly those new to research, might require additional support to be able to implement the sort of worthwhile measures that we're talking about, but to do that in a meaningful and effective way might need something else. So what do you think trials units could do? Is there anything that they could do to reduce that theory practice gap?
I think that might actually be one for Kerry Hood, who's a CTU manager, but I think training around this particularly is really important. But yeah, I can pass over to Kerry Hood. I thought you were going to ask me the critical care question, Sean. I'll come back to that.
That's coming. That's coming.
So I think it is training, but I think it's probably training in the RDN. And it's so, as I said, I think we can design our protocols to be and the materials we've got to be as good as possible, but we also need people on the ground who are frequently being metricized purely around recruitment figures. So that's all that they're measured on. We need to think about how we kind of incentivize and train them to take the extra time, because it does take extra time. And I think that's the bit about the theory practice gap. And it does worry me sometimes that we spend so much time talking from the kind of clinical trials unit perspective about how we do this, that we don't engage as much as we could do with the staff on the ground. And I'm still struck by when I did my first trial for where we were including people with mild to moderate learning disabilities a number of years ago. I actually had someone quite senior in what was the then RDN, it wasn't called that then, turn around and say, "Oh, our staff can't support this trial at all." And I'm like, "Why?" And they said, "Because they're not trained to be able to deal with people with a learning disability." And I'm like, "But you do cancer trials and you do asthma trials and you do diabetes trial. How can you tell me that you've got people trained in informed consent if you can't include?" So I think it's this kind of, it comes back to the black box of horrendousness, and I think we need to get some of it out to there.
Yeah, agreed. And again, your point from earlier about responsibility is shared. This is not all on the shoulders of. It's not all within our gift. Like, it's not our responsibility. There are research delivery network staff too. Amy, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I've had the same experience, Kerry, and I did suggest the person substituted a different identity characteristic and see if they would still be saying that. But it is a common idea that you have to be specially trained for people with a learning disability. But I think you actually hear that people with communication problems, and I know, you know, we've all come across that. And I think it's that lack of confidence in the staff assessing capacity who are actually doing that in the field recruitment that means they err on the side of caution, and they're not given the tools necessarily to support somebody to really make a choice. They are under a time pressure, and so they will think, "Oh, I can't include this person." Or even, you know, if they're coming from like a clinician's waiting room or something, the clinician will say, "Not that person, it'll take you too long, don't bother with them." You know? So we've got layers of kind of gatekeeping before we even get to our process. And I think, yeah, we need more training, and to realize that we should be incentivizing high quality research consent processes rather than just numbers. Because if we only reward on numbers, we'll always get the easy people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with that. Now, we've got about another 5 minutes or so for questions. I do want to get a few more. This one, Kerry Woolfall, it's definitely coming your way. This is the question around critical care. So critical care trials by their nature have participants who cannot consent. By and large, we have processes for this. What more do we need to demonstrate to funders?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think there are 4 things that I would think through if I was going to go to a funder and designing a critical care trial. The first thing I would actually look at the evidence that supports conducting research without prior consent if there's an urgent need to treat and it fits under that legislation. So urgent action has to happen for the purposes of the trial. You're talking immediate interventions. There are papers. I've got a funny surname, so if you Google my surname, you'll find things from a number of papers from a number of different settings around conducting research without prior consent, involving children, involving adults. And then also accompanying that, if you go through the training that we've been speaking about today, there's a section within the training that leads you to links to guidance. And there's guidance from the Connect study from children. So I would look at that and actually to design your trials according to that. There's lots of good recommendations there about pre-trial thinking. There's also the Perspective study that was led by Professor Bridget Young, which is about adult ICU trials and what you need to think about in terms of that. And PPI is mentioned in both of those documents. And I think good PPI to help you think through how much time do we have here? What approach to consent is appropriate? What should our information look like? And when can we actually inform families as soon as possible afterwards? And then finally, if you're not finding your answers there for your particular intervention, if it's something new, novel, or a change in what would be usual clinical practice, because that's what most of our evidence supports at the moment, then I would suggest really thinking about writing in qualitative research at the beginning of your study and actually bespoke exploration of your particular interventions and trial and designing it that way in a lot more depth. So I hope that helps.
That was a great answer. Thank you, Kerry. Brilliant. I'm going to see if we get one more question in, and this has come in. So for anybody, When running a trial that is collecting primary outcome data mainly through linked data, are consultees required if a participant who previously had capacity and provided informed consent loses capacity during the follow-up term? So let's say that follow-up is collected 10 years later. And this person saying they've received mixed guidance on whether consultees are or are not required. Does anybody here have a definitive answer, or as close as we can get? Vicky.
So I'm not sure there is a definitive answer. And I know this is something that the HRA are looking at, because of course the basis from which data might be held might be on consent. And when we think about the ability to withdraw, to opt out, if someone lacks capacity to consent, they might lack capacity to withdraw from the data as well. So it is a complicated situation, I think, and I'm sure that's probably what the question is getting at. And of course, it's different. So if it's a clinical trial, if someone loses capacity under the clinical trial regulations, that consent endures the loss of capacity, but it doesn't if it's under the Mental Capacity Act, for example. So again, there are different types of studies that we might be thinking of in this kind of space. But essentially, if it's just routine data, if the person has given consent at the time of being enrolled in the study, and you might ask them to, again, nominate someone that the trial team could approach in that circumstance to see their advice about whether they think the person would continue to grant access to their data or not. That could potentially be an option as well. So it very much depends on what activity is required at what point and what type of clinical trial it is. And I think that HRA are doing some work in this space, because of course, as we have much more, data-enabled trials, this will increasingly become something that we need to think about more closely.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm going to try and sneak in one more question. So if there's an answer to this, it's going to be really quick. And it's because it came in beforehand and it's come up again. And it's essentially, as researchers, we might aim to make our information as clear and accessible as possible. And then it gets sent to, for example, ethics committees who suggest changes, which it means it no longer is as accessible and clear as we originally intended it to be. What then? How do we fix that particular challenge, if there are any suggestions? So Kerry, all for.
Hi, but based on feedback from quite a few qualitative studies when we've asked this question, when we're designing trials, I think if anyone has seen the Peter Knapp template of what an information sheet should look like, it includes on the first page what the bullet points, what that are the key priorities, and they're usually developed either from PPI or from the qualitative research. What does this potential population really want to know? Make them right up front on that first sheet, because most people, when you speak to them, don't really read much of the information anyway. It can go in handbags, or it's just skim read, but those first key points are sometimes read. And then also another suggestion we get a lot is to maybe make an accompanying video. It doesn't have to be a fancy, expensive animation. It could be a summary. And then if people want to have a listen to that quickly to get the key points, they can do and go back to the information later. But this comes up all the time. Patients say we want shorter information sheets. Ethics require extra information, and it seems to increase over time. It's a bit of a challenge.
It is, and I think you're absolutely right to essentially hold your ground and say, this is why we are presenting things in this way. This is our basis for it. What's yours? I've shown you mine. What you show me your evidence. So I think that's the answer to many of these sorts of questions, is we have a rationale. If it's very quick, Anna, because we'll close up in a couple of meetings.
I was just going to say that I've recently had a request from a rec committee, an NHS rec committee, to change my participant information and consent forms, and I used my PPI committee and the feedback I got from them to justify and hold that ground, and that was very positively received. So I can say from first-hand experience that has been well received.
Yeah, and I certainly, my experience with ethics committees, it's all positive basically. I think they're willing to engage and listen, and I've just seen a comment come in from Mark about I think it's from Mark, from training for REC members. So the event I was at yesterday was a training event for REC members, and there was a big chunk around diversity and inclusion, some of the issues we're talking about today. So I think the Health Research Authority certainly recognised the need to inform REC members, among others. So I think that is bringing us very much to a close. So thank you for a great discussion. We could continue that discussion if we had time, which we don't, sadly. But great questions. We've answered quite a lot of them, not all of them. Great answers. I really enjoyed that. So it really is just to show you again the links that Vicky showed us earlier to where you can get that training. Mark told us before we started that he did the training this morning. He really enjoyed it. So that's a job for all of us to work through the training and engage with it. It's very nicely put together. And I think essentially there's nothing else really for me to say apart from there is the recording. That recording will get sent out to attendees. And if your colleagues weren't actually able to attend, then they'll be able to look at that. So do engage with the training. Send any comments to the email address that you've got there. And there is a feedback survey as well. So if you have it on the webinar, so if there's any opportunity you have to complete that, then that would be greatly appreciated. And I think that's it from me. I don't know whether Vicky, if you've got any last or final words, but I think that's been a great session.
No, just to thank everyone for attending, to thank the panel members, you, Sean, for hosting. It's all very much appreciated. And thank you everyone that took part in the survey, and do get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for everybody taking part, and have a very good remainder of the afternoon. Take care. Thank you.